Hello everyone. Tonight we find ourselves standing before a medieval castle, its tall stone walls rising quietly against the fading light, not as a place of chaos or clashing swords, but as something far more unexpected. Something calm, slow, and almost soothing. You might have imagined this place as loud, dangerous, full of shouting guards and dramatic intrigue. But as you step closer, you realize that the loudest thing here might just be your own footsteps on the gravel. And already, you're beginning to suspect that if you were actually dropped into this world, you probably wouldn't survive. Not because of danger, but because of how unbelievably patient you'd need to be. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy, maybe late at night or early in the morning, go ahead and share your location and the time. It's always fascinating to see where these quiet journeys reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a gentle hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You stand just outside the castle gates, expecting urgency, perhaps guards shouting or horses rushing in and out. But instead, the scene is still. A guard leans against the wooden gate, not lazily, but with a kind of practiced patience. He nods at you, as if you've been expected all along, even though you definitely have not RSVP'd to this medieval gathering. The castle itself feels less like a military fortress, and more like a carefully organized village wrapped in stone. The walls are thick, yes, but they don't hum with tension. They simply exist, solid, dependable, and quietly reassuring. You might even feel a strange sense of relief, as if you've entered a place where time moves differently, where urgency has been politely asked to wait outside. This isn't entirely what you expected, and historically, that mismatch between expectation and reality is something scholars often note when discussing medieval life. Popular imagination paints castles as constantly under threat, but in reality, long stretches of peace were far more common. For example, after the Norman conquest, many castles built across England were not immediately sites of battle, but rather centers of administration and daily life. Historians still debate whether castles were primarily symbols of power or practical homes. But as you stand here, it feels like the latter might be winning the argument. You pass through the gate, half expecting someone to stop you dramatically, but no one does. Inside, the courtyard opens up in a surprisingly gentle way. People are moving about, but not rushing. A woman carries a basket of something that smells faintly like bread. A man leads a horse at a slow, almost thoughtful pace. Somewhere, you hear the soft clinking of metal. Not the sharp clash of weapons, but the calm, repetitive tapping of a blacksmith who seems in no hurry to finish whatever he's working on. And here's something a bit odd. Despite all the stone and structure, the castle doesn't feel cold or lifeless. In fact, it feels lived in. There's a warmth that comes not from temperature, but from routine. Everyone here seems to know exactly what they're doing, and more importantly, when they're doing it. It's like stepping into a world where your calendar has only 3 events. Wake up, do your task, and exist peacefully. You might even start to feel slightly out of place, not because you don't belong, but because you're used to a faster world. You're used to notifications, deadlines, the constant hum of something needing your attention. Here, the only thing demanding your focus is the gentle rhythm of daily life. A boy runs past you, but even his running feels subdued, as if he knows that too much excitement would disrupt the quiet agreement everyone here seems to share. And then, just as quickly, he slows down, returning to a walk. You can't help but admire the commitment to calm. Now, while this peaceful atmosphere might seem ideal, there are small reminders that life here is still medieval. Hygiene, for example, is not quite what you'd hope. There's a faint smell lingering in the air, something earthy and persistent. It's not overwhelming, but it's definitely there, like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. Fun fact, many castles had designated areas for waste disposal that relied more on gravity than on any kind of plumbing innovation. You don't need to investigate further. Trust me. Still, the overall feeling remains surprisingly serene. You wander further into the courtyard, noticing how the buildings are arranged with a kind of practical harmony. Nothing feels excessive. Everything has a purpose, and that purpose is rarely urgent. There's a rhythm here, one that doesn't rely on clocks or alarms, but on habit and expectation. The sun dictates much of the day, and people move with it, not against it. It's a pace that feels almost foreign to you, yet strangely comforting. And perhaps the most unexpected part is how little drama there is. No one is arguing loudly. No one is rushing into crisis. Even the guards seem more like caretakers than warriors, their presence reassuring rather than intimidating. Of course, this doesn't mean that castles were never sites of conflict or tension. Far from it. But those moments were often the exception, not the rule. Most days were filled with the kind of quiet continuity you're witnessing now. Days that blended into one another, forming a steady, predictable flow of life. As you continue to walk, you begin to realize that this calm isn't accidental. It's the result of structure, of routine, of a shared understanding that life here moves at a certain pace. And once you adjust to that pace, everything else starts to make sense. You take a deep breath, letting the stillness settle around you. It's not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that feels full. Full of small, unnoticed moments that together create something unexpectedly peaceful. And as you stand there, in the middle of this stone-walled world, you can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the most surprising thing about life inside a medieval castle isn't how dangerous it was, but how calm it could be. The calm you felt in the courtyard doesn't disappear overnight. It simply reshapes itself into something even softer as the castle drifts into morning. You don't wake to alarms or sudden noise, but to the slow, steady ringing of a bell somewhere above you. It's not urgent. It doesn't demand anything. It simply suggests that the day has begun. You lie there for a moment, unsure whether you're supposed to get up immediately or if the castle will politely wait for you to feel ready. Spoiler, it will not wait. But it also won't panic if you're a little slow. Around you, the sounds of life begin to gather gently. Footsteps echo faintly through stone corridors. A door creaks open. Somewhere, someone coughs in a very medieval way, meaning loudly and without apology. You sit up, noticing how the light filters through a narrow window, thin and soft, like it's trying not to disturb anyone. This is your first real introduction to the castle's morning rhythm, and it's surprisingly consistent. Bells mark the time, not in precise minutes, but in broad strokes. Wake, work, eat, rest. This system wasn't random. Many castles followed structured daily schedules influenced by monastic traditions, where time was divided by prayer and routine. The spread of these rhythms can be traced back to events like the Benedictine rule, which emphasized order, repetition, and balance. Historians still debate whether this structure made life more disciplined or simply more predictable. But as you stretch your arms and prepare to face the day, predictable suddenly sounds very appealing. You step out into the corridor, and immediately you notice something. No one is rushing. People are moving with purpose, yes, but not with urgency. A servant walks past you, carrying a small wooden bucket, nodding politely as if this exact moment has happened 1,000 times before. And in a way, it has. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is already underway in a nearby hall. You follow the faint smell of bread, slightly burnt, slightly comforting, and find yourself among a group of people quietly eating. There's no dramatic feast, no overflowing table. Just simple food, eaten slowly. You take a seat, half expecting someone to question your presence, but again, no one does. Either you've blended in perfectly, or medieval castles had a very relaxed guest policy. Let's go with the first option. It's more flattering. The meal itself is modest. Bread, a bit of cheese, maybe some leftover stew from the night before. It's not the kind of breakfast that would trend on social media, but it does the job. And more importantly, it fits the rhythm. Food here isn't about excitement. It's about consistency. Now, here's something a little strange. People don't talk much while eating. Not because they're unhappy, but because the act of eating is treated as its own quiet moment. You try to whisper something, just to test the atmosphere. But your voice feels too loud, like you've accidentally brought modern energy into a medieval calm zone. So you chew, slowly, thoughtfully. You even begin to notice the texture of the bread, the slight tang of the cheese. And before you know it, you've accidentally become mindful. Congratulations, you've invented medieval meditation. After the meal, the castle doesn't suddenly burst into activity. Instead, it transitions smoothly, almost invisibly, into work. People disperse, each heading toward their tasks. And what's remarkable is how little confusion there is. No one asks, "What should I do today?" They already know. You follow along, curious, watching as routines unfold like a well-rehearsed play. A woman begins sweeping the same section of floor she likely swept yesterday. A man checks supplies, counting items with a quiet focus that suggests this is both important and deeply familiar. Even the animals seem to understand the rhythm, moving calmly as if they too have memorized the schedule. And here's a bizarre little detail you might not expect. Some castles had designated gong farmers, whose job was to clean out latrines. Yes, that was an actual profession. And no, it was not considered glamorous. You silently decide that whatever role you've been assigned in this imaginary scenario, you sincerely hope it's not that one. Still, even this less appealing aspect of castle life fits into the broader pattern. Everything has its place. Even the unpleasant tasks are handled with the same steady rhythm, ensuring that nothing disrupts the overall balance. You begin to realize that this calm isn't just about silence. It's about predictability. There's comfort in knowing what comes next, in moving through a day that doesn't surprise you with sudden chaos. And while that might sound boring at first, it quickly becomes something else entirely. It becomes reassuring. Of course, not every historian agrees that castle life was this tranquil. Some argue that the monotony could be stifling, not that the lack of variation made days blur together in a way that felt limiting rather than calming. Historians still debate whether this kind of routine fostered contentment or quiet frustration. But as you watch the morning unfold, it's hard to see it as anything other than peaceful. You step outside again, into the courtyard you saw yesterday, or what feels like yesterday. The same people are here, doing similar things, moving in familiar patterns. And yet, it doesn't feel repetitive in a negative way. It feels stable. The sun has risen a bit higher now, casting a gentle warmth over the stone walls. The air carries the faint sounds of work, but nothing sharp or overwhelming. It's a kind of background noise that blends into the environment, like a soft soundtrack you didn't realize was playing. You take another deep breath, letting it out slowly. And for a moment, you forget about time entirely. There's no rush to get anywhere, no urgent task pulling you forward. You simply exist within the rhythm, carried along by it. And as the morning settles into its steady pace, you begin to understand something important about life inside these walls. It's not about excitement. It's about continuity. And somehow, that makes everything feel just a little bit easier. By now, you've started to notice something subtle but powerful about life inside the castle. Nothing happens by accident. Every movement, every task, every quiet interaction seems to follow an invisible pattern. And as you drift further into the day, you begin to see that the true architects of this calm are not the lords or knights, but the servants. You find yourself lingering near a narrow corridor that opens into a busier part of the castle. Not chaotic, never chaotic, but active in a quiet, deliberate way. A servant passes you carrying folded linens, stacked with surprising precision. Another follows, balancing a tray of simple tools, walking carefully as if the floor itself deserves respect. No one is rushing, but no one is idle either. It's a strange balance, like watching a group of people who have collectively agreed to move through life at exactly the same pace. You almost want to ask them how they do it. But something tells you the answer would simply be, we always have. This kind of structured service didn't just appear overnight. In many medieval households, especially after the administrative systems expanded following the Magna Carta, castles became centers of organized labor, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Historians still debate whether this hierarchy created stability or reinforced rigid social divisions. But from where you're standing, it feels less like oppression and more like coordination. You follow one of the servants into a larger hall, where a group is quietly preparing for the next phase of the day. Some are arranging benches, others are checking supplies. There's no shouting, no dramatic instructions, just a shared understanding of what needs to be done. It's almost hypnotic. You notice how each person repeats their actions with small variations, like a routine that's been refined over time. A woman folds cloth in the same careful way, over and over. A man inspects wooden cups, turning each one slightly differently, as if searching for something only he understands. These are not mindless tasks. They're practiced ones. And here's something oddly fascinating. Many servants in medieval castles were deeply skilled, even if their work seems simple at first glance. Cooking, for example, required knowledge of preservation, timing, and resource management, especially when ingredients were limited. You glance toward the kitchen area and catch a glimpse of someone stirring a pot with the kind of focus you'd expect from a modern-day chef. Except here, there are no recipe books, no timers, just experience. You begin to realize that this calm environment isn't effortless. It's maintained, carefully, constantly, and yet it never feels tense. You step aside as two servants pass each other in the corridor, exchanging a brief nod. No words, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. It's like watching a dance where everyone already knows the steps. You try to imagine yourself fitting into this system. Could you wake up every day and perform the same tasks with this level of consistency? No phone to distract you, no sudden changes to break the pattern. Just repetition. Honestly, you might last 3 days, maybe 4 if there's good bread involved. But for the people here, this rhythm is not a limitation. It's a structure that makes life manageable. In a world without modern conveniences, predictability is a kind of comfort. It means fewer surprises, fewer risks, fewer moments where things spiral out of control. Of course, that doesn't mean everything is perfect. There are small signs of fatigue if you look closely. A servant pauses for just a second longer than expected, adjusting their grip on a bucket. Another stretches their back briefly before returning to work. These are human moments, quiet reminders that even the most stable routines require effort. And then there's the hierarchy. You notice how certain areas of the castle are clearly reserved for specific roles. Some doors remain closed to most people. Some paths are taken only by a few. It's not openly enforced, it's simply understood. Everyone knows where they belong. Historians still debate whether this strict division of roles created a sense of order or quietly limited personal freedom. As you watch the servants move through their day, it's hard to say. There's no visible resentment, but there's also little deviation. It's a life of structure. And structure, as you're beginning to learn, can feel both comforting and confining at the same time. You wander toward a small window overlooking part of the courtyard. From here, you can see multiple routines unfolding at once. Someone carrying water, another repairing a tool, a pair of workers quietly discussing something in low voices. None of it feels urgent. None of it feels chaotic. It's like watching time slow down, not because it's forced to, but because it naturally settles into this pace. And then, something slightly unexpected happens. A small mishap. A servant drops a wooden cup. It clatters softly against the stone floor, the sound echoing just enough to draw attention. For a brief moment, everything seems to pause. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The servant quickly picks it up, checks it, and continues on. No scolding, no reaction, just continuation. And somehow, that moment says everything about this place. Mistakes happen, but they don't break the rhythm. They're absorbed into it. You lean back against the cool stone wall, letting that idea settle in your mind. In your world, a small mistake might trigger stress, frustration, maybe even a chain reaction of problems. Here, it's just another part of the day, acknowledged and then gently moved past. There's a quiet wisdom in that. As the hours pass, you begin to feel yourself adjusting. Your steps slow down. Your breathing becomes more even. You stop expecting sudden changes, and instead, you start anticipating the steady flow of events. And the most surprising part? You don't miss the chaos. You don't miss the noise. You don't even miss the constant need to be somewhere else. Instead, you find yourself standing in the middle of a medieval castle, surrounded by people who have mastered the art of doing the same things day after day, and making it feel like enough. By the time you begin to understand the rhythm of the servants, your curiosity naturally drifts upward, toward the person you assume must be orchestrating all of this quiet efficiency. The lord of the castle, the one you imagine pacing dramatically, issuing commands, making bold decisions that shape the fate of everyone within these walls. So, naturally, you expect at least a little excitement. Instead, you find paperwork, a lot of paperwork. You're led, well, not officially led. More like you wander confidently enough that no one stops you. Into a chamber that feels important but not intimidating. The room is modestly furnished, with a heavy wooden table, a few chairs, and several stacks of parchment that look suspiciously like they've been there longer than anyone would like to admit. And there he is, the Lord, not standing dramatically, not shouting orders, just sitting, reading, occasionally writing, occasionally sighing in a very relatable, very human way. You pause, slightly confused. This is the person in charge? Yes. Yes, it is. In reality, much of a medieval lord's life revolved around administration rather than adventure. Especially after systems of governance became more structured following events like the Domesday Book. Landowners were expected to manage resources, track obligations, and maintain records. Historians still debate whether this made noble life more efficient or simply more tedious. But as you watch the Lord carefully reviewing what appears to be a list of grain supplies, tedious feels like a strong contender. You edge a little closer, trying to observe without being too obvious. He dips a quill into ink, pauses for a moment, as if reconsidering all of his life choices, and then writes something down with slow precision. There's no rush, there's no urgency. Just careful, deliberate movement. And here's the surprising part. No one is interrupting him. No constant stream of people demanding attention. No dramatic announcements, just occasional visits. Someone entering quietly, speaking in low tones, then leaving just as calmly. It's less like a command center and more like a very slow-paced office. You might even feel a strange sense of familiarity. Replace the parchment with emails, the quill with a keyboard, and suddenly this scene isn't so different from modern work life. Except here, there's no reply all. And honestly, that alone might make this the superior system. The Lord eventually stands, stretching slightly, and walks toward a window. You follow at a respectful distance, pretending to be deeply interested in the stone wall if anyone looks your way. From the window, he surveys the courtyard. Not with suspicion, but with quiet attentiveness. He's not looking for problems. He's confirming that everything is as it should be. And it is. You begin to understand that leadership here isn't about constant action. It's about maintaining balance, ensuring that the routines you've been observing continue uninterrupted. It's less about control and more about continuity. Of course, this doesn't mean the Lord's life is entirely free of responsibility. Far from it. Decisions about land use, disputes between tenants, agreements with neighboring regions, all of these pass through him at some point. But even these decisions are handled with a kind of measured patience. No dramatic speeches, no sudden declarations, just careful thought, followed by quiet action. You notice a small interaction as another figure enters the room, a steward judging by the way he carries himself. They speak briefly, discussing something that sounds like crop yields. You catch a few words, but nothing urgent. No raised voices, no tension. It's almost soothing. And then, just as you're settling into this calm, you learn something slightly unusual. In some medieval courts, lords would spend hours reviewing not just serious matters, but also surprisingly minor details, like the condition of tools or the exact number of chickens in a nearby village. Yes, chickens. You try to imagine a modern leader spending their afternoon deeply concerned about poultry inventory, and you can't help but smile. Still, these details mattered. In a world where resources were limited, small things added up. And the Lord's role was to keep track of those things, ensuring that nothing slipped through the cracks. Historians still debate whether this level of involvement made lords more effective or simply more overworked. But from your perspective, it looks like a life defined by steady responsibility rather than dramatic power. You wander around the room, careful not to disturb anything, and notice how little has changed over the course of what feels like hours. The same stacks of parchment, The same quiet atmosphere, the same slow, deliberate movements. Time here doesn't rush forward, it settles. You glance back at the Lord, now seated again, continuing his work with the same calm focus. There's something almost meditative about it, a rhythm that mirrors everything else you've seen in the castle. And then it hits you. This entire place, from the servants to the schedules to the quiet courtyard, is held together by this exact kind of consistency. Not by bursts of energy or dramatic leadership, but by steady, ongoing attention. It's not exciting, but it works. You lean against the wall, letting that realization sink in. In your world, leadership often feels fast, reactive, filled with constant decisions and interruptions. Here, it's slower, more deliberate, almost restful. And yet, nothing is neglected. Nothing is chaotic. Everything simply continues. Of course, there are moments when this calm would be disrupted, times of conflict, of change, of uncertainty. But those moments are not what define daily life. They are interruptions, not the baseline. The baseline is this: a quiet room, a wooden table, a man reviewing grain supplies with the seriousness of someone who understands that even the smallest details matter. You take one last look around before stepping back into the corridor. The sounds of the castle return: soft footsteps, distant voices, the gentle hum of ongoing work. And as you leave the Lord to his endless, surprisingly uneventful responsibilities, you realize something you didn't expect to learn here. Power in this world isn't loud, it's quiet. And most of the time, it's a little bit boring. By the time your attention drifts away from the Lord and his deeply committed relationship with parchment, something else begins to pull you in. A smell. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, but steady and persistent. Warm, slightly smoky, comforting in a way that makes you realize you're probably hungry again, despite having eaten what you generously called breakfast. You follow it, naturally, because in any century, food wins. The kitchen reveals itself gradually, not as a grand hall of culinary spectacle, but as a busy, grounded space where everything feels purposeful. There's movement here, more than in most other parts of the castle, but even this movement follows the same calm rhythm you've come to expect. No one is rushing, yet things are getting done. You step closer, watching as ingredients are handled with care that feels almost ritualistic. A pot simmers quietly over a fire. Someone stirs it with slow, practiced motions, like they've done this exact action thousands of times. Another person slices bread, not quickly, but precisely, each piece nearly identical. And here's where expectation meets reality once again. You might imagine medieval castle food as extravagant, lavish feasts with endless variety. But the truth is far more repetitive. Meals are often simple, built around whatever is available and preserved. Bread, grains, vegetables, maybe some meat if the situation allows. It's less royal banquet and more consistent survival with occasional upgrades. This wasn't just a matter of preference. It was necessity. Food supply depended heavily on seasons, storage methods, and local production. And the importance of managing these resources became especially clear during events like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when shortages forced entire regions to rethink how food was stored and distributed. Historians still debate whether such crises permanently changed dietary habits or simply reinforced existing practices. But standing here, watching this careful preparation, you can sense just how seriously food was taken. You lean slightly closer to the simmering pot, trying to identify what's inside. It's something. Definitely something. A mix of grains, maybe some vegetables, possibly meat, or at least something that used to be meat. It's not visually impressive, but the smell is reassuring. Familiar even. You realize that meals here aren't about excitement. They're about reliability. You're handed a wooden bowl, again. No one questions your presence, which is starting to feel less like luck and more like an unspoken rule of, if you're calm, you belong. Inside the bowl is a portion of the stew. You take a cautious bite. It's good. Not extraordinary. Not something you'd post about, but warm, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. The kind of food that doesn't demand your attention, but quietly earns your appreciation. And then, just as you're settling into this moment, you notice something slightly unusual. A small group nearby is preparing a separate dish, something a bit more elaborate. There are herbs involved, careful seasoning, a level of attention that stands out from the otherwise simple routine. This, you realize, is likely intended for the lord or higher-ranking members of the household. Even here, hierarchy exists, but it's not loud, or it's subtle. You watch as the dish is completed with quiet pride, then carried away with the same steady pace that defines everything else in this castle. No rush, no urgency, just completion. Now, here's a bizarre little detail you might not expect. Medieval kitchens often reuse the same pot continuously, adding ingredients throughout the day to create what was essentially an ever-changing stew. Yes, you heard that right. The soup you're eating might contain traces of meals from earlier, or yesterday, or let's not think too hard about it. You pause mid-bite, then decide it's best not to overanalyze. After all, you're still here. You're still calm. And most importantly, you're still not assigned to gong farming duty. Around you, people eat in the same quiet manner you noticed earlier. No loud conversations, no dramatic reactions. Just steady, focused eating. It's almost as if meals are another form of routine meditation, one that involves significantly more chewing. You begin to notice patterns again. Who sits where? Who eats first? Who finishes last? These small details repeat, day after day, creating a sense of order that extends even into something as simple as lunch. Historians still debate whether medieval diets were nutritionally sufficient or simply adequate for survival. But from your perspective, the consistency seems to matter more than anything else. You're not overwhelmed by choice. You're not distracted by variety. You just eat. And somehow, that feels enough. You set your bowl aside once you're finished, noticing how seamlessly the next phase begins. Cleaning, preparing, resetting. The cycle continues without interruption, like a quiet machine that never stops but never rushes. You step back from the kitchen, letting the warmth linger as you return to the cooler stone corridors. The smell fades slowly, replaced by the familiar scent of stone and air and something vaguely medieval that you've decided to stop identifying. And as you walk, you reflect on what you've just experienced. Food here isn't about indulgence. It's about rhythm. It marks the passage of time, anchors the day, and provides a moment of stillness within an already calm environment. It's predictable, yes. But in that predictability, there's comfort. You glance back one last time toward the kitchen entrance, watching as the same slow, steady motions continue. Nothing has changed. And that's exactly the point. Because inside these walls, even something as simple as a meal isn't meant to surprise you. It's meant to sustain you. Gently, quietly, day after day. After leaving the warmth of the kitchen behind, You return once more to the quieter corridors of the castle, where the air feels cooler, steadier, and just a little more echoey. Your footsteps sound softer now, not because the stone has changed, but because you've begun to match the castle's pace. Even the way you walk has slowed, as if rushing would somehow feel inappropriate here. You wander without a clear destination, which, surprisingly, seems to be exactly how things are meant to happen. There's no map, no signs, just a network of hallways, staircases, and doorways that gradually reveal themselves as you explore. And what you begin to notice is this. The castle isn't just a fortress. It's a collection of spaces, each with its own quiet purpose. You step into a small chamber first. It's modest, with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a single slit window letting in a thin ribbon of light. This is someone's living space. Not grand, not decorated, just functional. You can almost feel the routine that happens here. Sleep, wake, repeat. You quietly step back out, half expecting someone to appear and question your curiosity. But again, no one does. At this point, you're beginning to suspect the castle has collectively decided you're part of the furniture. You continue on, turning a corner and finding yourself in a larger hall. The ceiling rises higher here, supported by thick wooden beams. The space is mostly empty, save for a few benches and a long table. This, you realize, is a communal area, used for gatherings, meals, or simply existing together in shared silence. And yet, even here, there's no sense of urgency. No lingering tension, just space. Castles like this evolved over time, often expanding as needs changed. After events such as the Black Death, many castles were modified to accommodate shifting populations and functions. Historians still debate whether these changes made castles more adaptable or simply more complex. But as you move through these rooms, it feels less like complexity and more like quiet layering. Each space added with purpose, then gently absorbed into the whole. You climb a narrow staircase, the steps worn slightly from years, decades, centuries of use. Each step feels familiar, even though you've never been here before. At the top, you find a small alcove overlooking part of the outer wall. From here, the world beyond the castle becomes visible. Fields stretch into the distance, calm and undisturbed. A few figures move slowly far below, their actions almost blending into the landscape. There's no sign of conflict, no distant chaos. Just more of the same steady rhythm, extending beyond the walls. You lean against the stone, feeling its cool surface, and for a moment, you simply watch. It's quiet up here, quieter than anywhere else. And strangely, it doesn't feel lonely. You begin to realize that the castle's design isn't just about defense, it's about containment. Not in a restrictive sense, but in a grounding one. Everything you need is here. Every space serves a purpose. Every corner contributes to the overall balance, even the hidden areas. You discover one by accident, a narrow passage tucked behind a partially open door. It's dimly lit, the air slightly cooler, and the space feels more private, more secluded. Perhaps it's used for storage, or quiet conversations, or simply as a place to step away from the routine without actually leaving it. You step inside briefly, then step back out, deciding that some mysteries are better left undisturbed. Also, you've seen enough medieval layouts by now to know that wandering too far into hidden passages rarely ends well. Still, the existence of these spaces adds another layer to the castle's calm. It's not just open and predictable, it's also quietly complex, offering moments of solitude within an already peaceful environment. Now, here's a slightly unusual detail. Many castles included garderobes, small, private latrine rooms built into the walls, often with vertical shafts that carried waste downward. Yes, this means that certain parts of the castle had a very specific function, and gravity played a starring role. You make a mental note to be cautious about where you stand below certain windows. Again, medieval life keeps things interesting in its own unique way. As you continue your exploration, you pass through more rooms, some empty, some occupied, all consistent in their simplicity. There's no excess here, no unnecessary decoration. Just what's needed, arranged in a way that supports the daily rhythm you've been observing. You begin to notice how the castle guides movement. Narrow corridors slow you down. Open spaces allow you to pause. Staircases create transitions between different layers of activity. It's almost as if the architecture itself is encouraging you to move calmly, to take your time. Historians still debate whether castle design intentionally shaped behavior or simply reflected practical needs. But walking through these spaces, it feels like the former might be quietly true. You find yourself returning to the courtyard once more, completing an unplanned loop. The same people are here, moving in the same patterns, continuing the same tasks. And yet, it doesn't feel repetitive. It feels continuous. You pause near the center, looking around at the walls, the windows, the small details you might have missed before. A crack in the stone, a slight variation in the wood. Tiny signs of time passing slowly but surely. And that's when it really settles in. This place isn't static, it's steady. There's a difference. Static feels stuck. Steady feels alive. You take a slow breath, letting the air fill your lungs, and realize that you've stopped expecting anything dramatic to happen. You're no longer waiting for change or excitement. You're simply moving through the spaces, just like everyone else. And somehow, in a castle made of stone and silence and carefully arranged rooms, you found a rhythm that feels almost like home. As the day continues its unhurried journey, you begin to notice a subtle shift, not in pace, but in purpose. The essential work has been done, or at least paused, and the castle seems to exhale slightly, easing into something softer. Not rest exactly, but something close to it. This, you realize, is what passes for entertainment. Now, before your mind jumps to dramatic performances or lively celebrations, you should adjust your expectations. Medieval entertainment inside a castle is gentle, quiet, occasionally charming, and sometimes so calm that you're not entirely sure whether it counts as entertainment or just existing with slightly more intention. You follow a faint sound, music perhaps, into a modest hall. Inside, a small group has gathered. Not a crowd, not an event. Just a handful of people sitting or standing. Thus, their attention focused on a single figure near the wall. A musician. He's holding a lute, plucking its strings with slow, deliberate care. The melody is simple, repetitive, and soothing in a way that feels almost designed to make your eyelids just a little heavier. No dramatic crescendos, no sudden changes. Just a steady flow of sound that fills the room without demanding attention. You find a place to sit, careful not to disrupt the balance of the space. And as the music continues, you begin to understand something important. Entertainment here isn't about excitement. It's about atmosphere. This kind of music wasn't just for enjoyment. It was part of daily life, woven into the routine rather than set apart from it. The tradition of courtly music, which evolved through periods influenced by events like the 100 Years' War, often served as a way to maintain morale and continuity during uncertain times. Historians still debate whether such performances were primarily artistic expressions or social tools. But sitting here, listening to the gentle rhythm, it feels like both. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sound settle around you. It's not trying to impress you. It's not trying to stand out. It simply exists, much like everything else in this castle. And then, just as quietly as it began, the music ends. No applause, no grand conclusion. The musician nods slightly, and the small group disperses just as calmly as they gathered. You blink, half expecting someone to say, "And now for the next act." But there is no next act. That was it. That was the entertainment. You have to admit, there's something refreshing about that. No pressure to react, no expectation to be amazed. Just a moment of shared experience, then a return to the rhythm. You wander further, curious about what other forms of leisure might exist here. In another corner of the castle, you find a pair of individuals engaged in a quiet game. A board rests between them, pieces arranged with careful precision. They move slowly, each action deliberate, as if time itself has agreed to pause for the duration of their match. You watch for a moment, trying to understand the rules, but quickly realize that the rules matter less than the pace. There's no urgency to win, no tension in the air. Just a steady back and forth that feels more like a conversation than a competition. You consider joining, but then remember that you don't actually know how the game works. And also, you'd probably ruin the calm by asking too many questions. So you quietly observe, which seems to be your primary role in this castle anyway. Now, here's a slightly unusual detail. Storytelling was one of the most common forms of entertainment in medieval settings, and some stories could last for hours, or even be continued over multiple days. Yes, imagine starting a story and being told, "We'll pick this up tomorrow." Your modern brain might struggle with that level of patience. You soon encounter exactly that. A small group sits near a wall, gathered around a figure who is speaking in low, measured tones. You can't catch every word, but you understand the structure. This is a story unfolding slowly, without urgency. There are pauses, moments of silence where the storyteller seems to let the words settle before continuing. You sit nearby, listening, and something interesting happens. You stop trying to follow every detail. Instead, you let the rhythm of the voice carry you, the way the music did earlier. It's not about the plot. It's about the experience. Historians still debate whether these stories served primarily as entertainment or as a way to pass down knowledge and cultural values. But here, in this quiet corner of the castle, it feels like they serve another purpose as well. They slow time. You lean back slightly, resting against the stone wall, and notice how your body has fully adjusted to this environment. Your breathing is steady. Your thoughts are quieter. You're no longer anticipating what comes next. You're simply here. Of course, not all forms of entertainment are this serene. There are moments, rare, but real, when the castle hosts larger gatherings, feasts, or celebrations. But those are exceptions, not the rule. The everyday version of leisure is what you're experiencing now. Small, quiet, and deeply integrated into the rhythm of life. You glance around at the others in the room. No one looks bored. No one seems restless. They're simply engaged in their own way, present without needing constant stimulation. And then you realize something that feels almost surprising. You're not bored either. You thought you might be. You expected to crave excitement, variety, something more dynamic. But instead, you find yourself appreciating the simplicity, the absence of pressure, the freedom from needing to be entertained at all times. You shift slightly, getting comfortable, and let your eyes wander across the room one last time. And the storyteller continues. The listeners remain still. The castle, as always, maintains its quiet balance. And as this gentle phase of the day settles in, you begin to understand that inside these walls, even leisure isn't meant to energize you. It's meant to calm you, to steady you, to remind you that sometimes doing less can feel like exactly enough. As the hours drift forward, so gently that you barely notice them moving at all, you begin to sense another layer of life inside the castle. One that isn't tied to bells or meals or even specific tasks. It's something broader, slower, something that exists beyond any single day. Time here doesn't just pass, it settles. You find yourself near one of the outer walls again, looking out across the landscape that stretches beyond the castle. The light has shifted slightly, softer now, warmer. The air carries a faint change, too. Subtle, but noticeable, like the world is quietly adjusting itself without asking permission. And that's when it becomes clear. The castle doesn't just follow a daily rhythm. It follows the seasons. Long before clocks divided the day into precise segments, life here was shaped by the gradual, predictable changes of the year. Work, food, movement, everything adjusted to the slow turning of time. After periods like the medieval warm period, seasonal patterns influenced not only agriculture, but also how castles functioned internally. Historians still debate how much climate shifts directly affected daily routines, but standing here, watching the landscape breathe, it's easy to believe they played a quiet but constant role. You notice small details first. The way the light lingers a little longer than before. The faint rustle of leaves carried on the breeze. The subtle difference in how people move. Slightly more relaxed, perhaps, as if the environment itself is guiding them. You realize that while your experience inside the castle has felt steady, it's not unchanging. It evolves, just slowly enough that you don't feel the shift until you pause and really look. In one corner of the courtyard, someone is adjusting a stack of supplies, preparing them carefully. Not urgently, but with intention. You overhear a few words, something about storage, about making sure things last. It's not dramatic, but it hints at a larger awareness. Because here, survival isn't about reacting to sudden crises. It's about preparing for what's coming, long before it arrives. You walk past a small group sorting through what looks like dried herbs. Their movements are careful, almost delicate, as they separate and organize each piece. This isn't just work. It's preservation. A quiet effort to carry the present into the future. And here's something a bit unusual. In some castles, people relied on storing food in ways that would last months, even seasons, leading to meals that tasted slightly different depending on how long they had been preserved. So yes, your stew from earlier might have had a seasonal personality of its own. Today's flavor, lightly aged mystery. You decide once again not to overthink it. As you continue walking, you notice how the castle subtly adapts to these seasonal rhythms. Windows are opened or closed depending on the air. Fires are managed differently. Even the pace of work shifts. Slightly slower here, slightly more focused there. Nothing abrupt, nothing forced, just gradual change. Historians still debate whether people living in castles were consciously aware of these shifts or simply adapted instinctively. But from your perspective, it feels like a bit of both. There's an awareness, yes, but it's quiet, almost subconscious. You pause near a shaded area, watching as a servant carries a bundle of wood across the courtyard. Not rushed, not strained, just steady. The kind of movement that suggests this task has been repeated so many times it no longer requires thought. And that's when it really settles in. This place isn't just calm because of routine. It's calm because it's aligned with something larger. The sun moves, the air changes, the seasons turn, and the castle follows. You lean against the stone wall again, feeling its familiar coolness, and for a moment, you let yourself simply exist within this flow. No need to check the time. No need to anticipate what comes next. Because what comes next will arrive when it's ready. Not before. Not after. You glance out once more at the land beyond the walls. It feels distant, but not disconnected. Whatever happens out there, whatever changes, whatever challenges arise, they will reach the castle eventually. But not now. Now, everything is steady. You think about your own sense of time, how often it feels rushed, fragmented, divided into tasks and deadlines. Here, time feels whole, continuous, like a long, unbroken thread that stretches quietly from one moment to the next. And the most surprising part? You don't feel the need to rush along it. You're content to move at its pace, slow, even, unhurried. Of course, this doesn't mean life here is immune to disruption. Harsh winters, poor harvests, unexpected events. These things exist and they matter. But they are part of the cycle, not interruptions to it. Historians still debate whether this cyclical view of time made life more predictable or simply more dependent on external forces. But as you stand here, watching the light fade just slightly toward the next phase of the day, it feels like a kind of quiet acceptance. Things change, but they change slowly. And in that slowness, there's a kind of peace. You push yourself gently away from the wall, taking a few slow steps across the courtyard. The same people are here, continuing their tasks, adjusting subtly to the shifting light and air. Nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels out of place. Everything simply continues, shaped not by sudden decisions, but by the steady turning of time itself. And as you move through this moment, this quiet, almost invisible transition, you begin to understand that inside these walls, life isn't measured by minutes or hours. It's measured by something softer, something slower, something that reminds you, without saying a word, that there's no need to hurry. As the day leans gently toward evening, something almost imperceptible shifts in the atmosphere. Not a sudden tension, not a dramatic turn, just a quiet awareness that the world beyond the castle walls still exists, even if it rarely interrupts the calm you've come to know. You notice it first in conversation, not loud, not urgent, just fragments of speech carried softly across the courtyard. A pair of workers pause briefly, exchanging a few words in low tones. You can't hear everything, but certain ideas drift through. News, movement, something happening somewhere else. Far away, always far away. You step a little closer, not to intrude, but to listen. And what you hear isn't fear. It's more like acknowledgement. A quiet understanding that beyond these walls, the world is less predictable. Inside the castle, everything follows rhythm. Outside, not so much. This contrast has always been part of castle life. Fortifications weren't just built for dramatic battles. They were built to create a boundary between stability and uncertainty. After events like the Siege of Orléans, castles became even more symbolically tied to protection, even if most days remained peaceful. Historians still debate whether castles were more psychological safeguards than practical defenses. But as you stand here, listening to these quiet conversations, it feels like they served as both. You glance toward the gate again, the same one you entered through earlier. It stands firm, unchanged, with a guard nearby who looks just as calm as before. No heightened alertness, no visible concern, just presence. It's as if the castle acknowledges the outside world, without letting it in. You walk along the inner wall, following its curve, and notice how life continues uninterrupted. A servant carries water, another organizes tools, someone sweeps a familiar patch of stone with the same steady rhythm you've seen all day. Nothing has stopped, nothing has accelerated. And yet, there's a subtle difference, a quiet awareness. You pass by a small group gathered near a shaded corner. They're speaking softly, their voices blending into the ambient hum of the castle. You catch a few words this time, mentions of travelers, of distant lands, of events that feel both real and distant at the same time. And here's something slightly unusual. News in medieval times often spread slowly and unevenly, sometimes arriving days or even weeks after it happened, which means that by the time people heard about something important, it was already part of the past. Imagine getting a notification today about something that happened 3 weeks ago, and everyone reacting to it like it's breaking news. You almost smile at the thought. In a way, this delay creates a buffer. Events don't crash into daily life. They arrive gently, softened by time. Historians still debate whether this slower flow of information made societies more stable or simply less responsive. But from your perspective, it feels like it contributes to the calm you've been experiencing all day. You stop near a narrow window, looking out again at the land beyond. The light is lower now, stretching shadows across the fields. The world outside looks just as peaceful as it did earlier. But you know, somewhere beyond your view, things are happening, unpredictable things. And yet, here, inside these walls, the response is not panic. It's continuity. You begin to understand that the castle's strength isn't just in its stone walls or guarded gates. It's in its ability to maintain rhythm, even when the outside world shifts. To continue moving at the same steady pace, regardless of distant events. Of course, this doesn't mean the castle is disconnected from reality. Decisions are made, preparations exist. There's an awareness of risk, of change, of potential disruption. But those things don't dominate daily life. They exist alongside it. You watch as a guard walks the length of the wall, his steps measured, consistent. Not hurried, not tense. Just part of the routine. His presence is a reminder that protection exists. But it doesn't feel oppressive. It feels quiet. You lean slightly against the stone, letting your thoughts settle. In your world, news often feels immediate, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. Here, it's different. It arrives slowly, is considered calmly, and then absorbed into the flow of life. There's a kind of resilience in that, a quiet strength. You notice how the people around you continue their tasks, unaffected in any visible way by the distant events being discussed. They don't stop. They don't rush. They simply continue. And maybe that's the point. Because if life stopped every time something uncertain happened elsewhere, nothing would ever move forward. So instead, the castle holds its rhythm. Steady, unbroken. You take one last look toward the horizon, where the light fades just a little more, and realize that whatever happens out there, whatever stories are unfolding beyond your view, they don't define this moment. This moment is defined by calm, by routine, by the quiet decision to keep going. You turn away from the window, stepping back into the familiar space of the castle interior. The sounds, the movements, the rhythm, they're all still there, unchanged. And as evening begins to settle in, you understand something you hadn't fully grasped before. The castle doesn't ignore the outside world. It simply refuses to let it disturb the peace within. And somehow, in that quiet balance between awareness and calm, it finds a way to remain steady. By the time evening fully settles over the castle, the shift is unmistakable, but still, somehow, gentle. The light fades not abruptly, but slowly, as if even the sun understands the rules here and chooses not to rush its departure. You feel it in the air first. Cooler now, softer, quieter. The courtyard that once held the steady rhythm of daytime tasks begins to empty, not all at once, but in a gradual unfolding. One person leaves, then another, then another, each stepping away as if following a pattern you can't quite see, but instinctively understand. No announcement, no signal, just transition. You walk slowly across the stone ground, your steps matching the calm pace you've fully adopted by now. The same spaces you explored earlier feel different in this dimming light. Less defined, more blended, as shadows stretch gently across walls and doorways. And yet, nothing feels uncertain. If anything, it feels more settled. This quiet descent into night reflects a broader truth about medieval life. The day didn't end with activity, but with withdrawal. After long periods of structured living shaped by traditions that evolved through eras like the Carolingian Renaissance, nightly routines became just as important as those of the morning. Historians still debate whether these routines were driven more by necessity or cultural habit. But as you move through the fading light, it feels like something deeper, something almost instinctive. You pass by a small group finishing what appears to be the last tasks of the day. Tools are set aside, surfaces are cleared. Nothing is left unfinished, but nothing is rushed either. It's a quiet closing of the day's chapter, done with the same care that defined everything before it. You glance toward the kitchen area again, now calmer, quieter. The warmth remains, but the movement has slowed. A final pot is moved, a final surface wiped. Then stillness. Dinner, much like every other meal here, has come and gone without spectacle. You barely noticed it happen, which somehow feels appropriate. Food marks time, but it doesn't interrupt it. You continue walking, drawn back into the corridors that now feel even more peaceful than before. The faint glow of torchlight replaces the sun, casting soft, flickering shadows that dance gently across the stone walls. There's something almost hypnotic about it. The way the light moves, the way the shadows follow. You pause for a moment, watching as the flame shifts slightly, responding to a subtle draft. It's a small detail. But in this environment, small details feel significant. Now, here's something slightly unusual. Many people in medieval castles slept in shared spaces or rooms that weren't as private as you might expect. Privacy, as you understand it, was not a common luxury. You consider this for a moment and quietly appreciate your modern bedroom. Very quietly. You find your way back to a smaller chamber, the one you briefly stepped into earlier. It feels familiar now, as if it's been waiting for you. The narrow bed, the simple chest, the thin window now showing only darkness beyond. You sit down slowly, noticing how your body is fully adjusted to the pace of the day. There's no restlessness, no urge to check anything, respond to anything, do anything. You're just here, and that feels enough. Historians still debate whether people in medieval times experienced this kind of mental stillness or if it's simply a modern interpretation of their routines. But sitting here, in the quiet of this small room. It's hard to imagine that they didn't feel at least some version of it. The castle itself seems to exhale. The sounds have softened even further now. Distant footsteps fade quickly. Voices, if they exist at all, are hushed. Even the air feels different, heavier, calmer, like it's settling into rest alongside everything else. You lie back slowly, the bed firmer than you'd prefer, but not uncomfortable. Just simple. You look up at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines of the structure above you, barely visible in the low light. Your thoughts move more slowly now, following the same rhythm that has guided you through the entire day. No sudden ideas, no racing mind. Just a gentle flow from one thought to the next. You think about the courtyard, the kitchen, the quiet music, the steady routines, all of it blending together into something that feels less like a series of events and more like a continuous experience. And that's when you realize nothing dramatic needed to happen for this day to feel complete. No excitement, no urgency, no interruption. Just a series of calm, connected moments, each one leading naturally into the next. The torchlight flickers one last time before fading slightly, leaving the room in near darkness. Outside, the world continues, as it always does. But here, inside these walls, everything has come to rest. You close your eyes, not because you have to, but because it feels right. Because the day has gently guided you to this point. Because there's nothing left to do. And as the final traces of sound disappear into the quiet, you feel yourself drifting. Not into sleep just yet, but into something close to it. A stillness. A calm. A soft, steady ending to a day that never rushed, never demanded, never overwhelmed. And now, as everything fades just a little further, it simply lets you rest. Word count 1065. The quiet lingers, even as the last awareness of the castle begins to soften and blur at the edges. You no longer feel the stone beneath you or the faint movement of air through the narrow window. Those details drift away, gently like they were never meant to stay. The rhythms of the day, so steady, so unhurried, have done their work. They've carried you, step by step, through a world where nothing needed to be rushed, where every moment had its place, and where calm wasn't something you searched for, but something that was always there. You can still almost hear it, the distant footsteps, the soft clink of tools, the quiet murmur of voices that never tried to rise above the stillness. All of it fading now, blending into something softer, something quieter, something that feels less like memory and more like a feeling, a gentle, steady calm. And maybe that's the most surprising part of all, that in a place you expected noise, tension, and constant motion, you found rest. The castle remains, as it always has, unchanged, steady, patient. But you don't need to stay there any longer. You can leave it behind, knowing that its rhythm will continue, quietly, without you. And as you drift a little further into that calm, letting everything soften just a bit more, you realize there's nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to think about. Just the quiet. Just the stillness. Just the gentle sense that for now, everything is exactly as it should be.